Hi, it's Writing Wednesday, and I'm here at the intersection of Freshwater and Cookstown Road, near my home in central St. John's. Behind me is Leo's Fish and Chips, which Rick Mercer says is his favorite place in St. John's for fish and chips. Most people would go for Chess's a little farther down the road. Neither of them is my favorite for reasons I'll reveal later. In fact, I've only eaten at Leo's once in my life when I was 16, and it still has some kind of awkward memories of a pre-breakup conversation with my high school boyfriend. Perhaps more significantly for the history of St. John's, this is about the area where on a very hot, dry July day in 1892, a spark lit in a hay barn set off a fire that quickly spread through the east end of St. John's and became known as the Great St. John's Fire of 1892. I've actually been thinking a lot lately about that day in 1892 because the first chapter of my new novel is set on the day of the Great Fire. And as I walk these streets of St. John's, I try to imagine what it might have been like 120 years ago. Here at Gower Street Church and at the Anglican Cathedral just across the way, people stashed their belongings, believing that the stone and brick walls of these great churches would keep their possessions safe. But in fact, as the fire raged on, the wooden roofs burned, doors burned, the lead in the stained glass windows melted, and in the end, nothing at all was saved of the things that have been stored in these churches. A lot of what we tend to think of as the classic architecture of downtown St. John's dates from the period of rebuilding after the fire. When I wrote By the Rivers of Brooklyn, one of the questions I most frequently got asked was how much time did I get to spend researching in New York? And of course the answer was never enough, but I also pointed out to people, even though you can visit a place, you can't visit it in the past. What a historical novelist wants is not to see what it looks like now, but what it looked like then. And what I need is some way to get back to 1892 and see what these streets that are so familiar to me looked like in the midst of and right after the Great Fire. Nowhere is this more true than here in Bannerman Park, which became kind of a refugee camp in the days after the fire for people who had been burned out of their homes. In 1892, the park was very different. It had just been open for a year. The bandstand, which people in St. John's tend to think of as the great historic landmark of the park, wouldn't be built until 1940. Of course, the pool and the playground came even later. And I strive to imagine what it was like then, and certainly what it would have been like when the park was filled with tents being lived in by people who had no homes to go back to. When you don't have time travel, books are the next best thing. I've been reading this book, St. John's City of Fire, by local author Paul Butler, who's done some really great research on the 1892 fire and helped to point me back to some really good primary documents. But in the end, although you can visit a place and you can read about what it was like back then, the writer kind of has to fall back on their imagination. One thing I don't have to imagine is the taste of a really good plate of chips, dressing, and gravy, which I would choose to get not at Chess's or at Leo's, but here at Fabulous Foods on Merry Meeting Road. Back in 1892, of course, this neighborhood was all farmland, but in more recent history, say in 1982, it's where I went to high school. And the chip shop across the street was called Chalkers. Today it's Fabulous Foods. Everybody my age still calls it Chalkers. Some things have changed. The cheapest fries with gravy used to be called a 50 with because it cost 50 cents. Today it does not cost 50 cents, but the flavor is still the same. And that, my friends, is a piece of living history. By the way, for those who are keeping track, it is November 21st, 3 weeks into NaNoWriMo. At 33,342 words, I am dead on with my word count. I'm on the home stretch, and I will see you next week.